There are weekends in sport that feel different the moment they begin. Not because of the championship standings. Not because of the prize money on the line. Not even because of the rivalries that have been building for months. Sometimes a weekend carries a different kind of weight entirely. A heaviness that you cannot quite explain until you are already inside it. And that is exactly what happened at Charlotte Motor Speedway during the Coca-Cola 600 weekend. From the moment the transporters rolled through the gates, something in the air was different. The garage felt quieter than usual. Conversations were shorter. People moved a little slower. Crew members who normally joke with each other around the haulers were standing in small groups, talking in lower voices. And if you paid close attention to the faces of the people who have spent years inside this sport, you could see something written on them that goes beyond the nervousness of race weekend. It was grief, real, raw, unfiltered grief, because this was not just another race weekend. This was a moment of reckoning for an entire community. A chance to gather in the one place that meant the most and remember a man whose fingerprints are all over the sport of NASCAR in ways that are still being discovered every week. Charlotte Motor Speedway has always carried a certain kind of prestige inside NASCAR culture. The Coca-Cola 600 is the longest race on the schedule. It demands more from drivers physically and mentally than almost anything else the sport asks of them. And historically, the names on the trophy at Charlotte have always carried meaning beyond a single race win. But this particular Coca-Cola 600 weekend was not going to be defined by lap times or strategy calls or fuel mileage debates. It was going to be defined by memory. The tributes began appearing around the facility before a single practice lap had been turned. Painted numbers on pit road. Flowers laid near tribute spaces. Photographs. Messages from fans who had driven hours to be at this track at this specific moment in time. People who had never met the man personally but felt a genuine connection to him through years of watching him compete at the highest level of the sport. That is something worth pausing on for a moment. Because in a sport that divides fan bases as sharply as NASCAR does, there are very few drivers who generate a universal emotional response. Very few careers that, when they end, cause people across rival fan communities to set aside their differences and simply grieve together. This was one of those moments, and for the people inside the garage, the crew members, the engineers, the team owners, the spotters, the drivers themselves, the weight was even heavier, because they were not grieving from a distance. They were grieving in the place where they had lived alongside this man for years, where they had seen him at his best and his worst, where they had competed against him, learned from him, been pushed by him. In the middle of this emotionally charged atmosphere, before the green flag dropped on the Coca-Cola 600, something happened on pit road that would dominate NASCAR conversations online for the rest of the weekend. Bubba Wallace was spotted kneeling beside a painted tribute on pit road. He stayed there quietly for several seconds. He did not call reporters over. He did not make a statement to the cameras. He did not turn it into a press moment. He simply took a private pause in a very public place, and then he walked away. Within minutes, social media had turned that quiet personal moment into a full-blown controversy. One side saw it immediately for what it was. A driver paying his respects to somebody who had genuinely mattered in his life and career. A human being grieving in the only way that felt right to him at that moment in that setting. But another group saw it very differently. They questioned his motives. They accused him of making the tribute weekend about himself, of using someone else's grief as a backdrop for personal attention, of performing a gesture that was calculated rather than genuine. The criticism spread fast. Posts went viral. Fan accounts weighed in. Debates erupted in comment sections that had nothing to do with racing. And for a period on Saturday, the online NASCAR conversation shifted completely away from the meaning of the weekend and toward a debate about one driver's intentions during a few quiet seconds on pit road. This is worth addressing honestly and directly, because the people making that criticism were, for the most part, making it without knowing a critical piece of context. And that context changes the entire picture. To understand why Bubba Wallace's moment on pit road meant what it meant, you have to go back several years. Back to a time before most casual NASCAR fans were paying close attention to his career. Before Bubba Wallace became one of the most recognized and talked about figures in Cup Series racing, he was a young driver trying to prove himself in the Camping World Truck Series. That is a familiar story in NASCAR. Talented drivers fighting for equipment, fighting for sponsors, fighting for the kind of opportunity that can make or break a career before it ever really gets started. The organization that gave Wallace one of his most significant early opportunities was Busch Motorsports. Busch built that organization in addition to competing at the absolute top level of Cup Series racing. He could have focused purely on his own championship campaigns. He could have kept his attention exclusively on his own career. Instead, he built a developmental program that gave opportunities to young drivers who needed them. And Bubba Wallace was one of those drivers. Wallace earned his first Truck Series victory driving under the Busch Motorsports banner. Think about what that means for a young driver still trying to establish himself. Your first win changes everything. It changes how team owners look at you. It changes how sponsors evaluate you. It changes your own internal belief in what you are capable of. Bubba Wallace got that first win because Busch believed in him enough to put him in competitive equipment. That is not a small thing. In a sport where opportunities are precious and equipment is everything, being given a legitimate shot by one of the biggest names in NASCAR carries enormous weight. It is the kind of thing a driver carries with him for the rest of his career. So when you see Bubba Wallace kneeling beside a painted number 8 tribute on pit road before the Coca-Cola 600, you are not seeing a stranger performing a gesture for the cameras. You are seeing a man who genuinely owes a meaningful chapter of his professional life to the person being honored. You are seeing grief that has a very specific and very personal foundation. That context matters. And the people who understood it, the people inside the garage who have watched this sport from the inside for years, were not the ones questioning Wallace's sincerity. While social media debated intentions, the people who actually work inside NASCAR were having a very different conversation. Multiple crew members and team personnel who were present at Charlotte that weekend spoke about the emotional atmosphere in terms that make it clear how different the experience was from the outside perception. One veteran crew member described the feeling with a simple observation that carries enormous weight. Busch changed lives in that garage. Not just influenced them, not just impacted them, changed them, in ways that were direct and personal and lasting. That is a sentiment that kept surfacing throughout the weekend. Because the scope of what Busch Motorsports meant to young careers in NASCAR goes far beyond any single driver. The organization served as a launching pad for multiple talents over the years. Drivers who went on to compete at the highest levels of the sport got their foundational experience there. Engineers and crew members built careers on the foundation of working in that program. When you understand that, the grief inside the garage during the Coca-Cola 600 weekend starts to make complete sense. These were not people mourning from a distance. These were people mourning something that had touched their lives in direct and tangible ways. And that is a very different kind of loss. One of the most powerful elements of the weekend had nothing to do with racing at all. Samantha Busch was present publicly during the Coca-Cola 600 weekend. She appeared alongside Busch, and for many people watching, whether they were inside the garage or watching from the grandstands or following along at home, that image carried more emotional weight than anything else that happened across the entire weekend. Because it is one thing to honor a racing career. Championships and wins and records are permanent and important. They belong to the history books forever. But seeing a family carry a loss that extends far beyond the racing world, in public at the place where so much of that career was written, that is something that reaches people on a level that statistics simply cannot reach. Several drivers and crew members were visibly moved when Samantha and Brexton were visible around the track. That emotional response was not manufactured. It was not performed for cameras. It was the natural reaction of people who understood that the loss they were honoring was personal in a way that transcended the sport. Then there was Kurt Busch. Seeing Kurt Busch at the tribute area during the weekend, laying flowers, taking time in quiet reflection, that was one of the heaviest images the Charlotte weekend produced. For anybody who has followed NASCAR over the years, Kurt represents a specific thread of the sport's history. He and his brother competed in the same era, raced against each other, built separate legacies that are now permanently intertwined with the story of a generation of NASCAR racing. Watching Kurt process that loss publicly, in the same space where so much of their shared professional story was written, said something about the depth of this moment that no amount of analysis can fully capture. When the engines finally fired and the Coca-Cola 600 got underway, there was a specific kind of urgency to the racing that felt appropriate for the occasion. The Coca-Cola 600 always extracts something extra from its competitors. The length of the race, the demand it places on both driver and machine over nearly 4 hours, tends to produce moments that feel earned in a way that shorter events sometimes do not. The racing was competitive. There were lead changes, strategy battles, moments of genuine drama. Charlotte produced the kind of race that the Coca-Cola 600 is built to produce. But the moment that will be remembered most from the 2025 edition of this race came after the checkered flag. When Daniel Suarez climbed out of his car in victory lane, the first thing he wanted to talk about was not his own achievement. It was not his team. It was not the championship implications. The first thing Suarez did was dedicate his victory to Kyle Busch. Suarez called him one of the most influential drivers of an entire generation of NASCAR racing. And in that moment, standing in victory lane with confetti falling and his team celebrating around him, Suarez chose to make that dedication the defining statement of his win. That is not a calculated PR move. That is a driver who genuinely understood the weight of what the weekend meant, and who found a way to honor it in the only way available to him in that specific moment, by making his victory a tribute rather than purely a personal celebration. That single gesture said something important about the culture of the sport and about the respect that was woven through every corner of the Charlotte weekend. To fully understand why this particular weekend carried so much emotional weight, you have to honestly reckon with what Kyle Busch meant to NASCAR over the course of his career. The statistics are genuinely extraordinary. 2 Cup Series championships, more than 60 Cup Series victories, an unmatched record of wins across all 3 of NASCAR's major national series. Numbers that most drivers who ever competed in the sport could not dream of accumulating in a full career. But the legacy goes well beyond numbers. Kyle Busch was one of the most polarizing figures in the history of the sport. That is not a criticism. It is, in many ways, one of the highest compliments you can pay a competitor in a sport that lives on storylines and personalities. He was the kind of driver who divided arenas. When his car led the field, half the grandstands cheered and the other half held their breath hoping someone would find a way to stop him. That level of emotional investment from fans, even fans who are rooting against you, is extremely rare. It requires a combination of sustained excellence and a personality that refuses to be neutral. Kyle Busch never asked for anyone's approval. He raced to win, he spoke his mind, and he made no apologies for either. And paradoxically, that authenticity is part of why the grief surrounding his loss feels so widespread even among people who spent years rooting against him every Sunday. Because people who genuinely follow NASCAR understood something that casual observers sometimes miss. The sport needs its villains as much as it needs its heroes. It needs the driver who makes winning look inevitable and unavoidable. It needs the name that motivates entire teams to come in on Monday morning already thinking about how to beat him next weekend. Kyle Busch was that for a generation of NASCAR. Beyond his own driving career, the impact he had through Kyle Busch Motorsports cannot be overstated. The organization gave platform and opportunity to drivers who might otherwise have remained stuck in developmental limbo indefinitely. Multiple careers that fans now follow in the Cup Series have a direct connection to the development opportunities that organization provided. Bubba Wallace is the example that got the most attention this weekend, and for good reason. But he is one among many. The reach of what Kyle Busch built in that developmental program extends through the current NASCAR garage in ways that are still playing out. That is legacy, not just what you win, but what you build, and what grows on after you. There is something worth addressing in how the controversy around Bubba Wallace's tribute moment developed, because it reflects a pattern that goes well beyond NASCAR. We live in an era where every emotional public moment gets immediately subjected to a kind of forensic scrutiny that strips the humanity out of it before most people have had a chance to simply feel it. A driver takes a quiet personal moment on pit road, and within minutes there are strangers online declaring that they know his motivations better than he does. There are threads analyzing the positioning of the cameras. There are accounts with large followings casting doubt on sincerity they have no possible way to evaluate. This is what modern sports culture does with grief now. It analyzes it. It rates its authenticity. It debates it as though sincerity is something that can be determined from a 15-second video clip posted to social media. And the result of that process is that the actual emotional content of the moment gets completely lost. The story stops being about a driver who lost someone who genuinely shaped his path into NASCAR. It becomes about the argument over whether that driver deserved to grieve publicly at all. That is a significant loss. Not just for the people directly involved, but for the sport as a community. Because moments like the one at Charlotte this weekend, moments where the garage comes together, where rivals become human beings again, where the weight of loss cuts through the noise of competition, those are the moments that remind people why they fell in love with NASCAR in the first place. The sport is not just machinery and pit strategy and championship points. It is also the people who fill those garages year after year, who share a common language built out of risk and speed and competition, and who form bonds that look nothing like ordinary professional relationships. When someone from inside that world is lost, the grief is real and it is complicated and it looks different for everyone who carries it. Some people speak. Some people go quiet. Some people lay flowers. Some people kneel for a few seconds beside a painted tribute on pit road before they have to go strap into a race car and do their job for 4 hours. All of it is real. None of it requires an audience's verdict on its sincerity. Away from the commentary happening on social media, the conversations among drivers and team members during the Coca-Cola 600 weekend were focused almost entirely on remembrance. Multiple people who were present at Charlotte that weekend described an atmosphere in the garage that felt unlike any normal race weekend. The competitive urgency that usually defines the space was present, but it was layered underneath something heavier and more reflective. Drivers talked about specific memories. Moments from earlier in their careers when Kyle Busch said something to them that stuck. Times when competing against him forced them to find levels of focus they had not known they possessed. Instances where watching him perform at his absolute best reminded them why they got into racing in the first place. Crew members talked about what Kyle Busch Motorsports meant to the career opportunities it created. Engineers who got their first real platform in that organization. Team members who built the foundations of their professional lives there. There was a consistent theme that kept surfacing in these conversations. The understanding that loss like this reshapes how you see the sport around you. When someone who contributed that fundamentally to the world you live in professionally is no longer present, the world looks different. The garage looks different. Even the racetrack looks different. And processing that kind of change takes time that social media debates simply do not allow for. As the weekend concluded and the NASCAR convoy prepared to move on to the next stop on the schedule, the feeling that lingered around Charlotte Motor Speedway was not simple sadness. It was something more complex. Something that mixed grief with gratitude, loss with appreciation, the awareness of what had been taken with a clearer understanding of what had been left behind. Kyle Busch's championships will remain in the record books for as long as the sport exists. The wins will be referenced in every honest historical conversation about the greatest competitors the sport has ever produced. The rivalries will be studied as examples of what sustained high-level competition looks like when it is driven by genuine ability and genuine desire. But the thing that the Coca-Cola 600 weekend at Charlotte illuminated most clearly was the human infrastructure of the legacy. The careers that were shaped. The confidence that was built in young drivers who needed someone to believe in their ability early. The developmental program that gave the sport some of the competitors it now watches every week. That part of the legacy does not appear in any record book. It is written in the careers of people who are still competing, still winning, still building their own stories inside the sport that gave Kyle Busch a platform to become one of its defining figures. Bubba Wallace kneeling on pit road was one visible expression of that invisible legacy. And the fact that it became controversial for a time says more about the culture of instant social media judgment than it says about the man taking that moment. Because the people who actually knew the history, who understood what was behind that gesture, were not confused about what they were watching. They were watching gratitude. They were watching loss. They were watching a man honor someone who changed the direction of his professional life. That is worth taking seriously. Even in the middle of a racing weekend. Even when the engines are about to fire and the job still has to get done. In the weeks following the Coca-Cola 600 weekend at Charlotte, NASCAR continues forward with its schedule. Race weekends arrive and depart, points standings shift, championship narratives develop. That is the nature of the sport. It does not stop moving. It cannot afford to. The calendar is relentless and the competitors inside it are conditioned to put one weekend behind them and focus completely on the next one. But legacies do not operate on race schedules. The conversations that began at Charlotte, about what Kyle Busch meant to the sport, about the careers his program helped create, about the specific human weight of this particular loss, those conversations will continue in garages and grandstands and living rooms for a long time. Because the sport is being reshaped in real time by people whose careers were touched by what Kyle Busch built. Every week that those drivers show up and compete at the highest level, every win they celebrate, every championship they pursue, a piece of that legacy is present in the story. The influence does not disappear. It just changes form. For the people who were at Charlotte that weekend, for the drivers and crew members and family members and fans who gathered there to honor someone who mattered, the Coca-Cola 600 of 2025 will always mean something beyond a race result. It will mean the weekend that the garage came together and remembered that competition, for all its intensity, is built on a foundation of human relationships, of mentors and students, of rivals who become colleagues who become, sometimes, the people who shape your entire professional life. Kyle Busch was all of those things to different people inside NASCAR. And the weekend at Charlotte made clear just how deep that reach was. Not just through the trophies and the championships, through the people still competing, still winning, still carrying forward a chapter of their own story that started because somebody believed in them early enough to matter. That is the kind of legacy that outlasts any record book. And in a sport that moves as fast as NASCAR does, that is worth slowing down to recognize.